We're now going to be solving quadratics. In order to solve quadratics, what we need to do is we need to set it equal to 0. So we could use zero property. Zero property states that anything times 0 is equal to 0. Why that's helpful is because after we factor, what we have are, in this case, two binomials, and they're multiplying each other. That means that since it's equal to 0, either x minus 3 is equal to 0 or 2x plus 1 is equal to 0. One of those has to be equal to 0 in order for the answer to be equal to 0, because the only way that you can get 0 is multiplying by a 0. So that means that for the first binomial, we're going to add the 3. 0 plus 3 gives us 3. For the second one, we're first going to subtract the 1. Then we're going to divide it by 2. And what we get is negative 1/2. So our two answers are either 3 or negative 1/2. It has to be one of those two values. So looking at our first example, what we're going to do is we're going to take the x minus 1 and we're going to set it equal to 0, or the x plus 5, and we're going to set that equal to 0. And now what we're going to do is we're going to solve for x. So we add the 1, and we get x is equal to 1. We're going to subtract the 5. So x is equal to negative 5. And so those right there are two answers. These two x values, one will give us a 0. So either if we plug in a 1, we get a 0 for the first one, or if we plug in a negative 5, we get a 0 for the second one. One of those has to be true. So for the next one, we have the 3x minus 1 is equal to 0, or we have the 2x plus 7 is equal to 0. We're going to add the 1, and we get 3x is equal to 1. We divide it by 3, so x is equal to 1/3. For the other one, we subtract the 7, and we get 2x is equal to negative 7. We divide it by 2, and we get x is equal to negative 7/2. So those right there are our two possibilities for giving us a 0. For letter C, what we have is a monomial and a binomial. Monomials are really easy. We set them equal to 0, and they always equal 0. So whenever it's a monomial, it's always going to be 0. Now for the binomial, we have 5 minus x is equal to 0. We first subtract the 5, and we get negative x is equal to negative 5. So that means that x is equal to 5. And of course, as what we stated earlier, 0 would be our other answer. Pause the video and try those next three. So for letter D, we have x minus 8 is equal to 0, or we have 4x plus 1 is equal to 0. For the first one, we add the 8, and we get x is equal to 8. For the second one, what we do is we first subtract the 1, and then we divide it by 4. And so we get x is equal to 8, or negative 1/4. Now, letter E, this one right here, what we notice is that we have three different polynomials: a monomial, a binomial, and another binomial. Now, once again, if we're looking at the monomial, monomials are always the same. It's always going to be 0. The binomial, we have 6x plus 8 is equal to 0. And then the other one is x minus 3 is equal to 0. So we subtract the 8. Then we divide it by 6, and we're going to reduce it. So x first is equal to 0. Then it's negative 4/3, because when we reduce negative 8 over 6, it's negative 4/3. And then for our last one, what we get is positive 3. Now for letter F, we have a monomial and a binomial. Once again, we set them equal to 0. And the monomial is always going to be the same. It gives us a 0. And then for the binomial, when we add the 6, it gives us a 6. Now, all of those were already factored. What we're going to do in this next part is we're going to factor them, and then what we're going to do is we're going to solve them. So if you remember, if we have a trinomial, what we're going to do is we're going to use the x method. So we're looking for two numbers that multiply together, give us 6, add up to 5, and that would be 2 and 3. And what we get is x plus 2, and then x plus 3 is equal to 0. Now, I'm hoping that you picked up the pattern. What the pattern is when solving these is, notice that for our first one, what we have is an x minus 1. Notice that our answer is a positive one. We have an x plus 5. Notice that our answer is a minus 5. Here we have an x minus 8. Notice that our answer is an 8. So we see that it's always the opposite. Now, when we're looking at this, that means that the opposite of 2 would be negative 2, and the opposite of 3 would be negative 3. Now, just to verify that we did this correctly, if you were to plug in a negative 2 plus 2 gives us a 0. If we were to plug in a negative 3 plus 3 gives us a 0. So those two are correct. Now, looking at letter B, this right here is a special factoring pattern. Notice that it's a difference of squares. So we have x minus 6 and x plus 6. What we're going to do is we're going to solve it by doing the opposites. Opposite of minus 6 is a positive 6. The opposite of a positive 6 is a negative 6. Now, letter C is a little tricky because it's not equal to 0. So what we have to do is we have to set it equal to 0. So we have x cubed plus x squared minus 12x equals 0. We notice that these three terms have a GCF, and that would be x. And then in parentheses, we have x squared plus x minus 12 equals 0. So we're looking for two numbers that multiply together, give us negative 12, and add up to positive 1. And that would be 4 and negative 3. So what we have is we have the x plus 4, and we have the x minus 3. And that right there is equal to 0. So whenever we have a monomial, remember that is always a 0. Then we do the opposites for the binomial, negative 4 and 3. Okay, pause the video again and try those next three on your own. So if we're looking at letter D, we're looking for two numbers that multiply together, give us 15, add up to 8, and that would be 3 and 5. So we have n plus 3 and n plus 5. Once again, since they're binomials, we're just going to do the opposites. So that would be negative 3 and negative 5. Letter E, we see that it's a difference of squares. So we're going to use a special factoring pattern, x minus 7 and x plus 7. So the two zeros would be 7 or negative 7. And letter F, notice that it's not equal to 0. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to set it equal to 0. That gives us 2x squared minus 2x cubed minus 4x squared minus 48x is equal to 0. We see that they all have a 2x in common, so that's x squared minus 2x minus 24 is equal to 0. We're going to factor it. Two numbers that multiply together give you negative 24, add up to negative 2. That would be negative 6 and 4. So we have 2x, x minus 6, x plus 4, and that's equal to 0. So whenever it's a monomial, remember, it's always 0. Then for the binomial, it's the opposite. And then we have negative 4.